Toby laid in bed. He pulled his covers over his head and stared out the window. He was tired, but there was no way he could fall asleep. He couldn't. There was too much to think about. He had been debating on whether or not to follow his mother's directions and forgive his father, or continue holding a grudge with his boiling hatred. He heard his door creak open. His mother patted into the room and sat on the bed next to him. She reached over and rubbed his back, which had been turned to her. "I know it's hard, Toby. Trust me, I understand. But I promise you it will get better," she said softly. "When is he going to leave?" Toby said with an innocent tone in his shaky voice. Connie let her gaze fall to her feet. "I don't know, honey. He's staying as far as I know," she replied. Toby didn't respond. He continued to look forward at the wall, holding his damaged arm near his chest. After a few moments of silence, his mother sighed before she leaned to kiss his cheek and stood up to walk out of the room. "Good night," she said as she closed the door. The hours passed slowly, and Toby couldn't quit tossing and turning. Every time he let his imagination take over, he heard the screeching of tires, the screaming of his sister, and he could uncontrollably jerk in his bed. He threw off his covers. Laying on his back, he pulled his pillow over his face and cried into it. He felt his chest rise and fall as he let out each shaky breath as he cried. He could hear his own pitiful weeping. He would have been screaming and crying if he didn't press his pillow over his face. After a few seconds, he threw the pillow out of his face as well and sat up. Hunched over, holding his head and breathing roughly, tears streamed from his eyes. He couldn't help but cry. He tried to keep it in, but he couldn't help but whine and whimper as he sat there. But he couldn't help but whine and whimper as he sat there shaking. He inhaled before he stood up and walked around his bed to the window and peered out, taking deep breaths, trying to calm down. He rubbed his eyes and looked out at the group of tall pine trees across the street. He stopped suddenly, and his gaze centered on something standing under a street light. He heard ringing in his ears, and he couldn't look away. The figure stood beside the street light, about 2 feet shorter than it. Long arms draped at its sides as it stared up at him with non-existing eyes. The figure had no features at all. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Yet it held Toby's hypnotized stare, seemingly peering into his very being. The ring in his ears grew louder and louder. Each second he stared before it, as all suddenly went black. The next morning, Toby woke in his bed. He felt different. He wasn't tired at all. And when he consciously woke up, it felt like he had been lying there awake for hours. He had no thoughts flowing through his mind. He sat slowly and stumbled over to the wall. But when he stood up, he almost felt dizzy. He stumbled toward the doorway and walked down the stairs. His parents were sitting at the table. His father was turned in with the small TV that sat on the countertop, and his mother was reading the newspaper. She quickly looked over when she felt slowly Toby's presence looming behind her. Well, good morning, sleepyhead. You have been sleeping forever. She greeted him in a hesitated smile. Toby slowly looked over at the clock and noticed it was 12:30 p.m. I made you breakfast, but it got cold. I was going to wake you, but I felt you needed sleep. Her expression fell from happy to worried as her son resisted responding to her. Are you alright? Toby stumbled over and sat by his father. He felt as if he was on idle, and he had no control over his actions. He was saying everything he did, but didn't seem to register in his brain properly. He reached out to his father's arms, but he ended up getting slapped. His father turned to him abruptly and pushed his chair over the foot. Don't touch me, boy, he yelled. His mother said, Alright, knock it off. This is the last thing we need. The days went by and things continued on as they were. Connie spent most of her time cleaning up the house, as her rude husband spent most of his time ordering her around. It was just how it used to be before the crash. Toby never really left his room. He would sit by his bed and tremble. His mind would wander, but his thoughts changed too fast to remember. He would pace around his small room, and like a caged animal would stare out the window. The unhealthy cycle continued. Connie continued to be pushed around by her husband, being way too submissive to him, and Toby remained in his room. Before he could think twice, he would begin to chew on his hands, tearing the flesh from his fingers. He would gnaw his hands until they bled. When his mother walked down on him while he was doing so, she reacted horribly. She rushed downstairs and grabbed the first aid kit, wrapping his hands in it. She demanded that he wouldn't leave her side from then. He isolated himself so much that he grew to hate being at others. His memory grew glitchy as well. He started missing memory of minutes, hours, days, and so on. He would begin talking nonsense and things completely unrelated conversations he would have. He'd go off about seeing things, sharks in his sink as he washed dishes, hearing crickets in his pillows, and seeing ghosts outside his bedroom window. All the nonsense landed him in a counselor's office. His mother grew too anxious about his mental health. She decided it would be good for him to talk to a professional about what he was feeling. Connie walked Toby into the building, holding his hands and guiding him in. As she walked him to the front desk and began talking to the lady who sat behind it. Miss Rogers, the lady said. Yes, that's me, Connie nodded. We are here to see Dr. Oliver. I'm here with Toby Rogers. Yes, right this way. The lady stood up and led them down a long hallway. Toby looked at the framed artwork down the halls and turned into the sound of the lady's high heels on the hard floor. She opened the door to a room with a table and 2 chairs. If we can get him to sit in here for a few minutes, I'll get the doctor. She smiled and held the door open. Toby stumbled into the room and sat down at the table. He looked over at his mother. The lady before the door slowly shut behind them. He looked around the room before he held his tightly bandaged hand and began to bite the bandages to unwrap his hands, but was interrupted when the door swung open and a woman in a black and white spotted dress and light blonde hair stepped in, holding a clipboard and pen. Toby? She asked with a smile. Toby looked up at her and nodded. Nice to meet you today, Toby. My name is Dr. Oliver. She put her hand out for him to shake, but hesitantly pulled away when she noticed his bandaged hands. Oh, she smiled nervously before clearing her throat and sitting back in a chair from him. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. Try to answer them as honestly as you can. Okay? She placed her clipboard down on the table. Toby nodded slowly and held his restrained hands to his lap. How old are you, Toby? 17. He responded quietly. She wrote down on the paper that was clipped to the clipboard. What is your full name? Toby Aaron Rogers. What is your birthday? April 28th. Who is your immediate family? Toby paused for a minute before answering her question. My mom, my dad, and... He stopped. My sister. I heard about your sister, dear. I'm really sorry. Her expression faded to a sad, pity-filled look. Toby nodded. Do you remember anything from the crash, Toby? Toby looked away from her. His mind went blank for a moment. He looked down his lap, and in the surrounding, he heard a faint ringing sound. His eyes remained in the first place. Toby? The counselor asked. Toby, are you listening? Toby felt a shiver go down his spine until he froze once again and slowly looked over out the little window through the door where he saw it. A dark, featureless figure peered at him. He stared, eyes widening. The ringing grew, growing louder and louder until suddenly the loud voice of the counselor broke his trance. Toby! She yelled. Toby jumped and fell sideways out of his chair and back up into the corner. The other Oliver stood up, holding her clipboard to her chest, a surprising look in her eyes. Toby met her eyes again. His breath hitched as he twitched.